I told her I wasn't in her HOA, and she called the cops like I just confessed to a crime. I was sweaty, holding a rake, barely done cleaning up my own yard. And suddenly, this woman I'd never seen was shouting at me about bylaws like she ran the whole county. At first I thought maybe she was confused. Then I thought maybe I was. But when she said people like you always cause problems, I realized this wasn't just about rules. Something was seriously wrong here. Comment what you do if someone colled thee. Cops on you for raking your own yard. I was just fixing my fence when Cynthia Cole showed up with half the neighborhood trailing behind her like some kind of parade. She pointed straight at my lake and announced to everyone within earshot, "Ha, amenity right here." I stopped hammering and looked up at her. Really? She's claiming my lake belongs to the HOA. I'd been getting these ridiculous warning letters for weeks about supposed violations on my property, with Cynthia insisting that some boundary redraw had magically swept my ranch into their little kingdom. The whole situation felt surreal, like watching someone try to steal your car while you're sitting in the driver's seat. The whole thing started because Cynthia wanted my lake as an amenity to boost home prices in her real estate listings. I'd been president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA for 3 years and apparently decided that wasn't enough power for one person. Now, she was standing there in her pressed coquepence and matching polo shirt clipboard, clutched to her chest like a shield, telling me how things were going to work. "You need to follow community standards just like everyone else, Jack," she said, her voice carrying that fake sweetness that makes your teeth hurt. I had to wonder if she practiced that tone in the mirror. I kept working on the fence post, not looking up. "It's interesting, Cynthia, because I'm not in your HOA." The words came out calm and steady, but I could feel the tension shift in the air around us. She went quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she processed what I just said. Then her face flushed red, and she started fumbling with her phone like it was a loaded weapon. "We'll see about that," she snapped, and before I knew it, she was dialing 911 over a property boundary disagreement. I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. The little crowd that had gathered started murmuring among themselves, some looking confused, others nodding along with Cynthia like this was perfectly normal behavior. Tom Harris, a lanky guy in his 50s who lived 3 houses down from Cynthia, was there bobbing his head in agreement with whatever she said, looking like one of those dashboard dogs. Emily Reed, a quiet woman who kept to herself most of the time, hung back near the property line, holding her phone up and taking pictures of everything. Now, I wondered what she was thinking about all this drama unfolding on a Tuesday morning. Maybe she thought it was entertaining, or maybe she was just documenting the crazy for posterity. Within 15 minutes, Deputy Carl Benson was pulling up my driveway with his lights flashing. It's looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Poor guy climbed out of his patrol car and walked over to where we were all standing. He's probably wondering what kind of domestic dispute he was about to wade into. Cynthia immediately launched into this dramatic explanation about how was refusing to comply with community regulations and creating a hostile environment. She made it sound like I was running some kind of criminal operation instead of just fixing my own fence on my own land. Deputy Benson listened politely, nodding at appropriate intervals. But I could see in his expression that he'd dealt with HOA disputes before and knew exactly how ridiculous they could get. "So what's the actual emergency here?" he asked, looking back and forth between us with the patience of someone who'd been through this dance too many times. I gestured toward my fence and explained that I was working on my own property, completely outside any HOA boundaries. Cynthia waved her clipboard and insisted that recent community amendments had expanded their jurisdiction to include my ranch. When Deputy Benson asked to see these amendments, Cynthia started backpedaling, saying they were still being processed through proper channels. The deputy gave her a long look, the kind that said he wasn't buying what she was selling, and explained that 911 was for actual emergencies, not neighborhood disputes. He suggested they try to work things out like adults before involving law enforcement again. I could see Cynthia's jaw tighten as he spoke, clearly not getting the response she'd hoped for. After he left with a warning about proper use of emergency services, I looked around at the little crowd that had gathered to watch the show. Tom was still there, now looking a bit less certain about whose side he should be in. Emily was still filming, probably getting some great footage of small town drama and action. A few other residents I didn't recognize were whispering among themselves, shooting glances back and forth between me and Cynthia like they were trying to figure out which team to join. I raised that fence post one notch higher just because nobody was stopping me, and partly because I wanted to make a point about property rights. Cynthia watched every move I made with those sharp little eyes of hers, calculating and cold. When I caught her stare, she smiled this smile that made my skin crawl like she knew something I didn't. "Laws around here go through me," she said quietly. Just loud enough for me to hear, but not loud enough for the others to catch. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but something about the way she said it felt like a direct threat. The way she stood there so confident and smug, like she held some kind of trump card I didn't know about. I had this photocopy of the county map in my pocket, the real one showing exactly where my property lines were, and I almost pulled it out right then and there. But something told me to wait, to see what other tricks she had up her sleeve before. I played my hand. Sometimes the best strategy is letting your opponent think they're winning while you gather intelligence. As everyone started drifting back toward the HOA subdivision, I kept working on my fence. But my mind was racing through everything that had just happened. What exactly had Cynthia been planning all this time? Those warning letters hadn't been random harassment. They had been part of some larger strategy she'd been building up to. Something bigger. Something that required getting the whole community on her side against me. I'd bought this ranch fair and square, paid every cent myself, and worked my ass off to make it what it was. Now, some HOA president with delusions of grandeur thought she could just claim it as community property. The whole thing was so absurd. It would have been fun if it wasn't happening to me. I don't know what she's been planning, but this feeling isn't right at all. The next morning, I found a bright yellow citation taped to my front gate, fluttering in the breeze like some kind of legal surrender flag. "Dock and fence violations," it said in official-looking print, complete with a case number and everything. That made it look legitimate at first glance. I stood there reading it twice, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was holding. This was me property, completely outside their boundaries, and they were citing me for improvements I had made with my own money and my own sweat. The citation threatened daily fines until I brought my structures into compliance with community standards. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or call a lawyer. The document looked professional enough with fancy letterhead and legal copy. Fooled most people who received it, but I knew better. Cynthia had clearly spent the weekend preparing for war. This citation was just the opening shot in what was shaping up to be a full-scale assault on my property rights. By noon, she'd scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she called the Jack Miller situation, like I was some kind of community crisis that needed immediate attention. I got a voicemail from Tom Harris sounding apologetic, but insistent that I should attend to clear up any misunderstandings, right? Like there was anything to misunderstand about property ownership. But I figured I'd better show up and see what kind of circus Cynthia was planning to run. Maybe if I showed up with facts and documentation, I could shut this whole thing down before it got completely out of hand. I remember the last fall I spent here with my father. He had carved a fishing rod handle for me from hickory, handed it to me like it was an heirloom. We sat on the end of the same dock I now wake up to, and he said, "You'll come back when you're tired of people pretending to be in charge." That sentence has been echoing more each day. The community center was packed that evening. Way more people than usually showed up for HOA meetings. Word had clearly gotten around about the drama, and everyone wanted front row seats to the show. Cynthia had set up a projector and everything with official-looking slides about community expansion and shared resources. She'd even printed programs. For the meeting like this was some kind of theatrical performance instead of a neighborhood dispute, I had to admit. She knew how to put on a production. It wasn't just silence I found here. It was memory layered into the floorboards. Every creak in this cabin sounds like something my father built. She started the meeting by explaining how important it was to maintain unified standards across all properties that benefited from community amenities. The way she said benefited made it sound like she was doing everyone a favor by trying to steal my lake. Then she clicked to a slide showing aerial photos of my property, including my lake. and announced Thatcher sent surveys had revealed it was actually within the expanded community boundaries. The crowd murmured appreciatively like she just revealed some amazing discovery instead of a complete fabrication. I raised my hand to object, but Cynthia cut me off before I could speak. "We'll have time for questions after the presentation," she said, waving her laser pointer like a magic wand that could make facts disappear. She clicked through slide after slide of community rules and regulations, all building up to this grand finale where she proposed making the lake an official HOA amenity. The crowd was eating it up, nodding and murmuring approval like they were watching a really good movie instead of a really bad lie. The whole presentation was built on fabrications, but Cynthia delivered it with such confidence that people actually believed her. She had fake boundary maps that looked official, altered community documents with forged signatures, even a timeline showing when the expansion had supposedly taken effect. It was impressive in a completely twisted way. She had done her homework, spent serious time and effort creating a whole fictional legal framework to justify stealing my property. When she finally opened the floor for questions, I stood up and asked to see the original county records that supported these boundary changes. Cynthia smiled that cold smile again and said, "Those documents were being processed through appropriate channels and would be available in due time. That's lawyer speak for I'm making this up as I go along and hoping nobody calls my bluff." But that's when Emily Reed spoke up from the back of the room. She'd been filming parts of the meeting with her phone, and during one of Cynthia's slides about community finances, she'd caught something interesting that Cynthia probably wished she'd kept hidden. The maintenance fund was running a deficit, a big one. Suddenly, Cynthia's obsession with adding my lake to the community amenities made a lot more sense. She wasn't just power hungry. She waystringed to solve the HOA's financial problems by stealing someone else's property and turning it into a revenue generator. The lake would attract new residents, boost property values, and maybe even justify raising HOA fees. It was actually a pretty clever scheme if you ignored the minor detail that it was completely illegal and morally bankrupt. Instead of arguing with Cynthia in front of her audience, where she clearly had the home field advantage, I decided to do something smarter. The next morning, I drove straight to the county office and asked to see the official property records for my ranch. The clerk, a friendly woman who looked like she'd been working there since the building was constructed, pulled up the files on her computer and printed out a fresh copy of the boundary map. This map clearly shows my lot sits outside every HOA boundary line. The ink hasn't even faded. She even made a joke about land getting cited by organizations that had no authority over it, apparently having dealt with overzealous HOAs before. During our conversation about boundary disputes, she happened to mention that she'd been seeing more of these cases lately, especially involving communities that were struggling with maintenance costs. Sometimes AXRAs get desperate when they can't balance their budgets, she said, filing my paperwork. They start looking for creative solutions that aren't always legal. That comment got me thinking about what other financial pressures might be driving Cynthia's aggressive tactics. I spread that county map across the hood of my truck in the parking lot and studied every line. Every marking, every notation that proved my property was completely separate from the Willowbrook Heights subdivision. There was a clear buffer zone between us, open land that belonged to nobody but the county. There was no way Cynthia's claims could hold up to legal scrutiny, but that didn't seem to be stopping her from trying. Her desperation suggested there were bigger stakes involved than just community amenities and property values. When I got home, there was an email waiting for me from an anonymous sender. No name, just a generic email address that could have belonged to anyone. But the message contained scanned copies of documents that made my coffee go cold. These were the original community contracts, the real ones, showing exactly what Cynthia had altered to support her fake boundary expansion. Someone inside the HOA was feeding me information, and they wanted to know just how deep Cynthia's deception went. The question was whether this anonymous ally was trying to help me, or setting me up for an even bigger fall. Should have known that anonymous email was either going to save me or destroy me completely. Cynthia smiled when she saw the map. Why would the loser be happy? 3 days later, Cynthia pulled her next move. She released what she called updated community Rule amendments, claiming my ranch was now designated as an included lit under some expanded jurisdiction policy. The document showed up in everyone's mailbox, printed on thick paper with weird font choices that made it look official to anyone who didn't know better. But I knew better. The text alignment was off, the margins were inconsistent, and the whole thing had that amateur desktop publishing look that screamed forgery. I sat in my kitchen reading through this fabricated legal document, wondering how far she was willing to take this charade. The fake amendments were actually pretty sophisticated. For a homemade job, Cynthia had clearly done her research, copying language from real HOA documents and municipal codes to give her fiction some credibility. She'd even included fake signatures from board members and made up reference numbers that sounded official. But when you know what real legal documents look like, the flaws become obvious. Real documents don't have inconsistent spacing, and they sure don't cite non-existent municipal codes that you can't find anywhere in Thekkenty records. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck so hard my knuckles went white as I drove to the county office. Again, sometimes I think I should have studied law instead of learning how to swing a hammer and wire electrical panels. Wrong choice, apparently, because now I was dealing with someone who thought she could rewrite property law with an inkjet printer. The whole situation was making me question whether I had the legal firepower to fight someone this determined, to steal what was mine. The CUNY clerk took one look at Cynthia's fake amendments and laughed out loud. "Honey, this isn't how boundary changes work," she said, pointing to several glaring errors in the document. "You can't just declare someone else's property part of your HOA by printing up some papers and calling them amendments. There's a whole legal process involving surveys, hearings, and county approval." She pulled out the original incorporation, documents for Willowbrook Heights, showing exactly what landways included when the HOA was established. My ranch wasn't anywhere on that map. She explained the actual process for boundary modifications, which involved multiple government agencies, public hearings, and months of paperwork. Even if they wanted to include your property, she said, they'd need your written consent and approval from the County Planning Commission. You can't force someone into an HOA against their will just by claiming their land belongs to you. The legal requirements were so complex that most HOAs never even attempted boundary expansions. Cynthia's fake amendments weren't just fraudulent. They were completely ignorant of how the system actually worked. While she was explaining the legal requirements for legitimate boundary changes, our conversation naturally turned to other HOA disputes she'd handled. "I've been seeing more of these cases lately," she said, pulling out a folder of similar complaints. "Communities that are struggling financially sometimes get creative with their interpretations of jurisdiction and revenue sources." She showed me several examples of HOAs that had overstepped their legal authority when facing budget shortfalls, including one case involving a shared access road where the community had fallen behind on loan payments. That example caught my attention immediately. The similarities to my situation were striking, especially given what Emily had revealed about the maintenance fund deficit at Cynthia's meeting. The HOA was struggling financially. That explained a lot about Cynthia's desperate grab for my property. Turning the lake into a community amenity wouldn't just boost her real estate listings. It could justify raising HOA fees to cover their mounting debts. She wasn't just stealing my land. She was trying to solve the HOA's financial problems by forcing me to subsidize their poor money management. That evening brought another email from my anonymous inside source. This one with even more damaging production. It wasn't just silence I found here. It was memory layered into the floorboards. "Every creak in this cabin sounds like something my father built." She started the meeting by explaining how important it was to maintain unified standards across all properties that benefited from community amenities. The way she said benefited made it sound like she was doing everyone a favor by trying to steal my lake. Then she clicked to a slide showing aerial photos of my property, including my lake, and announced that recent surveys had revealed it was actually within the expanded community boundaries. The crowd murmured appreciatively like she just revealed some amazing discovery instead of a complete fabrication. I raised my hand to object, but Cynthia cut me off before I could speak. "We'll have time for questions after the presentation," she said, waving her laser pointer like a magic wand that could make facts disappear. She clicked through slide after slide of community rules and regulations, all building up to this grand finale where she proposed making the lake an official HOA amenity. The crowd was eating it up, nodding and murmuring approval like they were watching a really good movie instead of a really bad lie. The whole presentation was built on fabrications, but Cynthia delivered it with such confidence that people actually believed her. She had fake boundary maps that looked official, altered community documents with forged signatures, even a timeline showing when the expansion had supposedly taken effect. It was impressive in a completely twisted way. She had done her homework, spent serious time and effort creating a whole fictional legal framework to justify stealing my property. When she finally opened the floor for questions, I stood up and asked to see the original county records that supported these boundary changes. Cynthia smiled that cold smile again and said, "Those documents were being processed through appropriate channels and would be available in due time." That's lawyer speak for I'm making this up as I go along and hoping nobody calls my bluff. But that's when Emily Reed spoke up from the back of the room. She'd been filming parts of the meeting with her phone. And during one of Cynthia's slides about community finances, she'd caught something interesting that Cynthia probably wished she'd kept hidden. The maintenance fund was running a deficit, a big one. Suddenly, Cynthia's obsession with adding my lake to the community amenities made a lot more sense. She wasn't just power hungry. She waystreamed to solve the HOA's financial problems by stealing someone else's property and turning it into a revenue generator. The lake would attract new residents, boost property values, and maybe even justify raising HOA fees. It was actually a pretty clever scheme if you ignored the minor detail that it was completely illegal and morally bankrupt. Instead of arguing with Cynthia in front of her audience, where she clearly had the home field advantage, I decided to do something smarter. The next morning, information than the first. The sender had somehow gotten hold of the contract that Cynthia had altered, along with the original version for comparison. The differences were startling. She'd changed dates, modified property descriptions, and even forged signatures to support her boundary expansion claims. Looking at the side-by-side comparison on my computer screen, I had to set down my coffee cup before I spilled it all over my keyboard. This wasn't just aggressive HOA overreach anymore. This was criminal fraud. The anonymous tipster had also included financial records that painted a complete picture of the HOA's mounting debt problems. Their maintenance fund was in worse shape than I'd thought, with unpaid contractor bills, overdue equipment payments, and what appeared to be a significant loan default. The community pool needed repairs they couldn't afford. The landscaping budget was 3 months behind, and several residents had filed complaints about deferred maintenance. Cynthia wasn't just power-hungry. She was desperating to find new revenue sources to keep the HOA from financial collapse. I spent the rest of the evening researching property law and HOA regulations, trying to understand exactly what legal weapons Cynthia might try to use against me. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that even though her claims were completely bogus, she could still cause me serious headaches with frivolous lawsuits and harassment. Fighting legal battles is expensive, even when you're clearly in the right, and lawyers don't work for free. Maybe that was part of her strategy to make the fight so costly that I'd eventually give up, but giving up wasn't an option. This was my property, bought and paid for with years of hard work. I'd scraped together every penny to buy this ranch, spending weekends and evenings fixing it up, making it into something I could be proud of. No HOA president with a clipboard and a god complex was going to take that away from me, no matter how many fake documents she printed up. The question was whether I had the stamina and resources to outlast her in what was obviously going to be a long, ugly fight. The next morning brought another surprise. Tom Harris called, sounding nervous and apologetic. He'd been doing some research of his own after watching Cynthia's presentation, and something about her boundary claims wasn't adding up. I measured the distances myself, he said. And your property line is definitely not where Cynthia says it is. He was starting to have doubts about the whole expansion story, especially after seeing how aggressive Cynthia had become about pushing it through without proper documentation. I thanked Tom for his honesty and told him I appreciated someone finally taking a critical look at Cynthia's claims instead of just accepting them at face value. But I couldn't help wondering if this was genuine doubt or if Tom was playing some kind of longer game. In neighborhood politics, you never know who you can really trust, especially when property values and money are involved. Every Anahas there. Own agenda, and sometimes the people who seem like allies are just positioning themselves for whatever outcome benefits them most. The anonymous email had given me powerful ammunition, but it also raised troubling questions. Who was feeding me this information? And what did they want in return? Was this someone genuinely trying to help me fight Cynthia's fraud? Or was I being set up for an even bigger fall? In my experience, when someone offers you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment, there's usually a catch. The question was whether I was desperate enough to take the help without knowing where it was coming from. This anonymous email could be a lifesaver or a trap. Way more clever. I should have seen it coming, but somehow I still wasn't prepared for what happened next. I came back from running errands to find a tow truck hooked up to my pickup with the driver already starting to winch it onto his flatbed. The reason, according to the official-looking notice taped to my windshield, was that I'd parked in violation of HOA regulations on community property. Community property. My own driveway on land that I owned outright and had the deed to prove it. I stood there for a moment trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was witnessing. The tow truck driver was a big guy with grease-stained coveralls, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. When I approached him with my property deed and county boundary map, his whole attitude shifted. "Look, man, I just go where they tell me to go, and hook up what they tell me to hook up," he said, unhooking my truck without argument. "But if you've got paperwork saying this is your land, I'm not taking your vehicle." He packed up his equipment and left, probably wondering what kind of neighborhood dispute he'd gotten dragged into. I found out later that Cynthia had called 3 different towing companies before finding one willing to come out based on her story about unauthorized parking. The first 2 had asked too many questions of other authority to authorize the tow. But this guy's company apparently didn't do much verification beyond getting a call and an address. Lucky for me, the driver himself had more sense than his dispatch office. But then something broke the pattern. One morning I found a pine wood birdhouse nailed to the tree near my dock. It hadn't been there last week. It had a small hole angled oddly toward my porch. I didn't think much of it until I noticed a tiny blinking red light inside. Within 20 minutes of the tow truck leaving, Deputy Carl Benson was back in my driveway with his lights flashing. I wasn't sure if he'd come because of another 911 call, or because he'd forgotten something from his previous visits, but either way, he looked tired of dealing with this situation. Cynthia had called again, this time reporting that I was interfering with legitimate HOA enforcement actions and threatening community safety. It's the way she described it to the deputy. You'd think I'd pulled a weapon on the tow truck driver instead of just showing him my property documents. Deputy Benson listened to my explanation while examining the county map I'd gotten from Patricia's office. He compared it to the fake boundary documents that Cynthia was waving around, shaking his head at the obvious discrepancies. Said to Cynthia with barely concealed irritation. False 911 calls can result in fines under state law. This is the 3rd time you've called us out here for what amounts to a property dispute that should be handled through proper legal channels. His tone made it clear that his patience was running thin. I didn't yell or lose my temper, though part of me wanted to. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. Every conversation, every fake document Cynthia showed, every claim she made about having authority over my property. Paper trails beat anger in situations like this. I had a feeling I was going to need all the evidence I could get. This wasn't Patu oversight, it was surveillance. Someone wasn't just watching my compliance, they were watching me. Cynthia had brought Tom Harris and another resident I didn't recognize along as backup. Like supporting actors in some community theater production, they stood behind her, nodding along with whatever she said. But I noticed that Tom looked less confident than he had at previous confrontations. Maybe his research into the property boundaries had raised more doubts than he had admitted to me. On the phone, the other resident, a woman in her 60s, wearing a Willowbrook Heights polo shirt, looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Emily Reed was there too, filming everything with her phone from a safe distance. I'd started to appreciate her presence at these confrontations. Not because I enjoyed having an audience for the drama, but because having an impartial witness with video evidence could be valuable if things got really ugly. During her filming, she caught something that I almost missed in the heat of the moment. Cynthia trying to justify her actions to Deputy Benson, but slip her real motivation for all this harassment. Later that evening, I tried confronting my neighbor, June, who always waved from her kayak. She wouldn't open the door. She slid a note under the crack instead. They threatened to fine me if I spoke to you. That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with bylaws. I was dealing with control. If we turn the lake into an amenity, my listings go up in price, she said, apparently forgetting that she was being recorded. It was a perfect admission that this whole boundary expansion scheme was about boosting her real estate business, not protecting community interests like she'd been claiming in public. Emily kept filming, capturing Cynthia's slip-up along with the deputy's reaction to hearing the truth behind all these fake emergency calls. Deputy Benson made some notes in his citation book and wrote something that made Cynthia go pale. He didn't show me what it was, but his warning about continued misuse of emergency services was clear enough. Next time you call 911 without a legitimate emergency, there will be consequences beyond just a warning, he told her. We have limited resources, and frivolous calls take officers away from real emergencies. The citation he handed her probably wasn't what she'd been expecting when she made that call. After everyone left, I sat on my porch trying to make sense of the escalating situation. Cynthia was getting more desperate and more reckless with each move she made. The fake documents, the unauthorized tow truck, the repeated abuse of emergency services. She was digging herself into a deeper legal hole while simultaneously making my case stronger. But desperate people do unpredictable things, and I couldn't help wondering what she'd try next when these tactics inevitably failed. The whole confrontation had lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a turning point. Cynthia had overplayed her hand, revealed her true motivations on camera, and earned herself an official warning from law enforcement. Tom Harris was clearly starting to distance himself from her increasingly extreme actions. Even her most loyal supporters were beginning to see that this wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about one person's greed and willingness to break the law to get what she wanted. I called my insurance company to report the attempted tow, figuring I should document everything for potential future claims. They were surprisingly helpful, explaining that attempted theft of a vehicle, even by someone claiming HOA authority, was still theft if they had no legal right to take it. They suggested I file a police report, which I hadn't considered but probably should have done immediately. Every official document and report would strengthen my position if this eventually went to court. That night I went through Emily's video frame by frame, studying Cynthia's slip-up about the property values and her real estate business. It was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to prove that her boundary expansion scheme was motivated by personal profit rather than community benefit. Combined with the financial records my anonymous tipster had provided, it painted a clear picture of fraud and abuse of authority. The question was when and how to use this ammunition most effectively. They've cornered me. Sometimes corners are the most dangerous places. And somewhere inside that birdhouse, a red light blinked twice. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of just defending myself against Cynthia's attacks, I'd go on the offensive and let the community see exactly what was happening on my property. The following weekend, I opened my ranch for informal tours, inviting neighbors to come see the lake and understand the real boundaries for themselves. I hung that county map Patricia had given me right next to the boathouse entrance, like mounting a superhero poster before the final battle. If Cynthia wanted to claim me land belonged to the community, let the community come, see what they'd supposedly been missing. The response surprised me. Families showed up with fishing poles and picnic baskets, genuinely curious about the lake they'd been hearing so much about. Kids ran around the shoreline while parents asked intelligent questions about property lines and HOA jurisdiction. Most of them had never actually seen the official county boundaries. And when they compared Cynthia's fake maps to the real documentation, the differences were obvious even to casual observers. Several residents commented that they had had no idea the lake was completely separate from their subdivision. Tom Harris showed up with his measuring tape and a handheld GPS unit, still trying to make sense of Cynthia's boundary claims. He spent an hour walking the perimeter of my property, taking readings and comparing them to both the official county map and the fake documents Cynthia had been circulating. "This doesn't add up at all," he said, shaking his head as he looked at his measurements. "According to these GPS coordinates, your property line is exactly where the county says it is. There's no way the HOA boundaries extend this far." I appreciated his thoroughness, but part of me wondered if I was being too trusting. Tom could genuinely be trying to get to the truth, or he could be gathering intelligence for Cynthia's next move. In my experience, people who switch sides once are willing to switch again if it serves their interests. But having him publicly acknowledge the boundary discrepancies was useful, especially with other residents watching and listening. Word would spread that even Cynthia's most loyal supporters were starting to question her version of events. Emily Reed was there too, filming parts of the tour and interviewing residents about their thoughts on the boundary dispute. Her footage would provide valuable evidence of community sentiment, showing that reasonable people could look at Thafix and reach obvious conclusions about who was telling the truth. She asked thoughtful questions about property rights and HOA authority, letting residents express their own doubts about Cynthia's increasingly aggressive tactics. The video evidence would be powerful if this eventually ended up in court. Sunday evening, word had gotten back to Cynthia about my impromptu community outreach. She responded exactly as I'd expected, with manipulation and fear-mongering. At the regular Monday HOA meeting, which I didn't attend, but heard about from multiple sources, she painted my ranch tours as a dangerous precedent. "Jack wants to make the lake private," she told the assembled residents. "Who knows how much he'll charge for access next week? Today, it's free tours. Tomorrow, it's expensive permits and exclusive memberships." The fear tactic was actually pretty clever, playing on residents' anxiety about losing something they'd never legally had in the first place. Cynthia was skilled at making people feel like victims, even when they were demanding access to someone else's property. She twisted my openness into evidence of future greed, suggesting that allowing people to visit the lake was somehow proof that I planned to exploit them later. The logic was backwards, but emotional manipulation doesn't always follow logical rules. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that several residents had pushed back against Cynthia's interpretation. They'd seen the evidence with their own eyes, walk at the property lines, and compared the official documents to her fabricated boundaries. Her credibility was starting to crack, especially among the more thoughtful members of the community who valued facts over fear. But she still had supporters, people who preferred simple answers to complicated questions and trusted authority figures more than their own observations. That week, I had a long conversation with a lawyer about my options. Sarah Martinez specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts, and she laid out 3 potential strategies for dealing with Cynthia's harassment. First, I could sue for defamation and harassment, seeking damages for the stress and financial costs of defending my property rights. Second, I could file for a restraining order to stop the fake citations and fraudulent claims. Third, I could investigate the financial aspects of the dispute, particularly that delinquent access road loan Patricia had mentioned. Sarah was particularly interested in the access road situation. If the HOA is behind on payments for infrastructure that provides access to your lake, she said there might be leverage opportunities we haven't considered yet. Sometimes the best defense is understanding what your opponent really has to lose. She suggested investigating who held the loan and what would happen if the HOA defaulted completely. The financial pressure might explain why Cynthia was so desperate to find new revenue sources. I left that meeting with a clearer sense of my legal options, but also with nagging doubts about whether I was prepared for the kind of long-term fight this was becoming. Lawyers are expensive, even when you're clearly in the right, and Cynthia seemed willing to escalate indefinitely. Part of me wondered if I was in over my head, fighting someone with more resources and political connections than I'd initially understood. But backing down now felt worse than losing everything in a legal battle I should have been able to win. The anonymous emails kept coming, each one providing more detailed information about the HOA's financial problems and Cynthia's role in creating them. The latest message included bank statements showing that the maintenance fund deficit was even worse than I'd thought, with several major expenses that had been approved without proper board oversight. Cynthia had been making financial decisions unilaterally, using her position as president to bypass normal approval processes. The community's money problems weren't just about deferred maintenance. They were about questionable spending and poor oversight. Reading through those financial documents, I started to understand the real scope of what I was dealing with. Cynthia wasn't just trying to steal my lake to boost her real estate business. She was trying to solve a financial crisis that she'd helped create through years of mismanagement. The HOA was facing potential bankruptcy, and turning my property into a revenue-generating amenity was her desperate attempt to avoid personal responsibility for the mess she'd made. The stakes were higher than I'd realized, which explained why she was willing to risk criminal fraud charges. The question remained, who was sending me this inside information, and what did they want in return? Someone with access to confidential HOA financial records was feeding me exactly the ammunition I needed to destroy Cynthia's credibility. Either I had a genuine ally inside the HOA who wanted to see justice done, or I was being manipulated by someone with an even more complex agenda. In neighborhood politics, the enemy of your enemy isn't always your friend. I have a plan, but don't know what Cynthia's figured out to destroy it. After my conversation with the lawyer about investigating the HOA's financial vulnerabilities, I spent several days researching debt collection agencies and loan transfers. Finding the specific details about the Access Road loan took more detective work than I'd expected. Public record searches, county filings, and business directories all pointed toward the same conclusion. The OS infrastructure debt had been sold to a collection agency after multiple missed payments. It took me the better part of a week to track down the right people and understand the process. The collection agency that held the debt was eager to talk once they realized I was a potential buyer rather than someone trying to negotiate a payment plan. The debt specialist I eventually connected with, working out of a strip mall office, looked like someone who'd been dealing with other people's financial problems for decades. Her desk was covered with folders full of defaulted loans, and she seemed genuinely surprised when I asked about purchasing one instead of trying to get out of paying it. Most people who call me are trying to negotiate payment plans or extensions, she said, pulling up the HOA's file on her computer. You're the first person who's ever asked to buy someone else's bad debt. She explained that the Access Road loan had been sold to her agency after the HOA missed 3 consecutive payments. The original loan amount was significant, but the collection agency was willing to sell it for a fraction of the original balance. They wanted to get problem loans off their books more than they wanted to maximize recovery. I asked her to walk me through exactly what rights and responsibilities came with purchasing the debt. According to the original loan agreement, whoever held the debt had the right to approve or deny access to the road since it crossed private land that served as collateral for the improvements. The HOA could use the road as long as they made their payments, but if they defaulted, the debt holder could restrict access or demand immediate full payment. It was a standard arrangement for infrastructure improvements, but it gave the creditors significant leverage over the HOA's operations. She seemed curious about why I wanted to buy a debt that most people would consider toxic. Don't like being told I can't park on my own land, I told her, which was true enough without getting into the complicated details of my dispute with Cynthia. She laughed and said she'd dealt with HOA conflicts before, understanding that sometimes normal people got pushed to extreme measures by petty neighborhood politics. Her job had given her a front-row seat to the kind of financial warfare that erupted when communities couldn't resolve their differences civilly. The paperwork process took nearly 2 weeks to complete properly, with multiple forms requiring notarization and verification of my financial ability to assume the debt. I had to provide bank statements, proof of income, and references from my business contacts to demonstrate that I could handle the payments if the HOA couldn't. The process felt heavier than buying the ranch originally had, partly because I was crossing a line from defensive to offensive strategy. This wasn't just protecting what was mine anymore. This was taking control of something that affected the entire community. Signing the final documents felt like playing chess against someone who didn't know I just captured their queen. The road to the lake was tied to this debt. Now I controlled whether the HOA could continue using it for community access. If they missed another payment, I could restrict access or demand immediate full settlement. It was a nuclear option that I hoped I'd never have to use. But having it gave me leverage that Cynthia couldn't have anticipated. The debt specialist, transfer with the efficiency of someone who'd done this transaction countless times. This ranks below even used car loans in terms of collectability, she said, stamping the final page of the contract. Most debt buyers are looking for quick recovery, but this one's been sitting on our books for months. They'll be happy to get anything for it. I pressed the pen hard enough to leave marks on the paper underneath, knowing that this signature was buying me more than just a financial obligation. I was buying a voice in how this community operated. The collection agency was remarkably cooperative, eager to transfer a problem asset to someone willing to take it off their hands. They provided all the original loan documentation, payment history, and legal agreements that came with the debt. Reading through the contracts, I discovered that the access road arrangement was even more favorable to the creditor than I'd initially understood. The HOA not only had to make payments, but they had to maintain the road to certain standards and provide insurance coverage for any accidents or damage. By the time all the paperwork was properly filed with the county, nearly 3 weeks had passed since I'd first started investigating this option. I now held the HOA's access road debt, giving me legal authority over their ability to reach the lake. That had been the center of our dispute. The irony wasn't lost on me that Cynthia's attempt to claim my property had led to me gaining control over their access to it. The timing couldn't have been better. According to the records, the HOA's next payment was due in less than 2 weeks. They'd already missed the previous 3 installments. If they couldn't come up with the money, I'd have legal grounds to restrict access to the road or demand immediate full payment of the remaining balance. Either option would put me in a position of strength for any future negotiations with Cynthia and the HOA board. I kept the debt purchase quiet, not even telling Tom Harris or other residents who'd been supporting my position. This was information that needed to be revealed at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. Cynthia was planning something. I could feel it in the way she'd been avoiding direct confrontation since the deputy's citation. She was regrouping, gathering resources for whatever her next move would be, but she was planning her strategy based on incomplete information about what I now controlled. That weekend, I sat on my porch looking out at the lake and the access road that wound through the trees toward the HOA subdivision. Cars drove past carrying fishing equipment and family picnics. Residents who had no idea that their access depended on payments their HOA couldn't afford to make soon. They'd learned that their community's financial problems weren't just about deferred maintenance and budget shortfalls. Papers are signed now, just waiting to see who shows up at that meeting. The community center was packed beyond capacity when I arrived that Thursday evening. Cars lined the street for 3 blocks, and people were streaming toward the building, carrying folding chairs and thermoses like they were attending some kind of outdoor festival. Word had spread that tonight's HOA meeting would finally resolve the boundary dispute that had been dividing the community for weeks. Cynthia had promised a definitive presentation that would settle the matter once and for all, complete with legal documentation and expert testimony. I carried my folder of evidence and wondered if she had any idea what was about to hit her. Cynthia had arranged the meeting room. It's like a courtroom with her presentation table at the front and rows of chairs facing forward. She'd even brought a microphone and projector, clearly planning to control the narrative from start to finish. Her supporters sat in the front rows, nodding encouragingly as she shuffled through her papers and tested her equipment. Tom Harris was there looking uncomfortable in the middle section. Emily Reed positioned herself near the back with her phone ready to record whatever happened. Tonight we're going to put an end to Jack Miller's attempts to privatize community resources, Cynthia announced, her voice amplified by the sound system. I have documentation proving that his property falls within our expanded boundaries, and I'm prepared to file a lawsuit to enforce the community's rights. She clicked to her first slide, showing an aerial view of the area with boundary lines that bore no resemblance to the official county map. The crowd murmured appreciatively, clearly impressed by the professional presentation she'd prepared. I didn't say anything at first, just sat in my chair near the back, letting her build up momentum while I organized my own materials. Sometimes, the best strategy is letting your opponent dig their own grave before you start filling it in. Cynthia clicked through slide after slide of fabricated evidence, fake surveys, and altered documents. She was actually making my case stronger with every lie she told, creating a public record of fraud that would be impossible to deny once I revealed the truth. When she finally opened the floor for questions, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The murmuring died down as I approached her presentation table. Instead of filing paperwork in silence, I projected the lease onto the community hall screen. I stood at the front of the monthly HOA meeting and pressed play on the security footage. Karen shouting on my deck, clipboard in hand. The room fell silent. "I didn't bring slides," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room without amplification. "But I did bring some papers you might find interesting." The first set was the official county map stamped and certified, showing my property completely, outside any HOA boundaries. Second was Emily's video footage queued up to Cynthia's admission about boosting her real estate listings. "This isn't about boundary disputes anymore," I continued, pressing play on Emily's phone. Cynthia's voice filled the room through the sound system she'd set up. "If we turn the lake into an amenity, my listings go up in price." The silence that followed was deafening. Someone in the middle of the room blurted out, "She really said that?" And suddenly, everyone was talking at once. But I wasn't finished. The third set of documents was the one that would change everything. "There's something else you should know about your HOA's financial situation," I said, spreading the debt transfer papers across her presentation table. "Your access road is tied to a loan that's 3 payments behind. As of Tuesday afternoon, I purchased that debt from the collection agency." The room went completely quiet as the implications sank in. I now controlled the road that every resident used to reach the lake they'd been fighting over. Cynthia stepped backward like I'd slapped her, her mouth opening and closing without making any sound. The microphone dropped from her hand with a feedback screech that made everyone we see. "That's not possible," she finally managed to whisper, but her voice carried through the sound system anyway. "Can't just buy someone's debt." I pulled out the official transfer document signed and notarized, showing that I was now the legal creditor for the HOA's delinquent access road loan. Deputy Benson, who'd been quietly observing from the side of the room, stepped forward and pulled out his citation book. "Ma'am, we've talked about this before," he said to Cynthia while writing something that made her hands shake. "Misuse of emergency services, filing false reports, and now it looks like fraud charges might be appropriate." He tore off a citation and handed it to her, then addressed the room. "Anyone who wants to file complaints about harassment or false documentation can contact the sheriff's office tomorrow." A man in the back, one of the quiet neighbors, stood up and said, "She fined my wife for hanging a prayer flag. I thought we were the only ones." Another voice followed, then another. It snowballed. The community's reaction was swift and decisive. Residents who'd been supporting Cynthia suddenly found themselves asking uncomfortable questions about what else she might have lied about. Tom Harris stood up and publicly apologized for supporting her boundary expansion scheme without doing his own research first. "I should have checked the facts before taking sides," he said, looking directly at me. "The GPS measurements don't lie, and neither do the county records." Several other residents followed Tom's lead, distancing themselves from Cynthia's fraudulent claims and expressing support for resolving the dispute fairly. The meeting dissolved into small groups of people examining the evidence I brought, comparing the real county map to the fake boundaries Cynthia had been promoting. Her carefully orchestrated presentation had backfired spectacularly, exposing her lies to the entire community and destroying her credibility beyond repair. Emily's video footage captured the entire confrontation, creating a permanent record of how the dispute had been resolved. The fake brochure Cynthia had used to advertise lake access without permission, the forged boundary documents, the false emergency calls to harass me into submission. All of it was now documented and witnessed by dozens of community members who could testify about what they'd seen and heard firsthand. As people began filing out off the community center, shaking their heads and talking quietly among themselves, I gathered my papers and prepared to leave. The weight of everything that had just happened was beginning to sink in. I'd won, but the victory felt hollow somehow. This whole mess could have been avoided if Cynthia had simply respected property rights and worked within legitimate channels. Instead, her greed and desperation had destroyed relationships and divided a community that should have been able to coexist peacefully. The most important travation wasn't about boundary lines or debt transfers. It was about character. When people feel cornered, you learn who they really are underneath the polite social facade. Cynthia had shown herself willing to lie, cheat, and break the law to get what she wanted. But the community had shown that most people, when presented with clear evidence, would choose truth over convenience and justice over personal advantage. Karen vanished from the weekly agenda. The HOA website's leadership tab listed a single, empty box where her photo had been. Cynthia completely collapsed. But is this really the end? But I wasn't done yet. Not until I made sure no one could play queen over this land again. The aftermath moved faster than I'd expected. By Friday morning, the HOA board had called an emergency session to remove Cynthia as president and begin damage control for the mess she'd created. Tom Harris was elected interim president with a mandate to clean up the community's finances and restore credibility to their governance. His first official act was formally apologizing to me on behalf of the entire HOA and acknowledging that all previous citations and boundary claims had been invalid. Deputy Benson followed through on his promise to take the fraud charges seriously. He filed a comprehensive report documenting the false emergency calls, forged documents, and harassment campaign that Cynthia had orchestrated. The district attorney's office was reviewing the case for potential criminal prosecution, and several residents had filed civil complaints seeking damages. Cynthia's real estate license was under investigation, and her business reputation in the community was permanently destroyed. The financial reckoning was even more severe. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover any legal costs related to Cynthia's fraudulent activities, leaving the community responsible for mounting legal bills and potential damage awards. The maintenance fund deficit that had started this whole mess was now compounded by legal fees and the cost of replacing her as property manager. But the most immediate problem was the access road debt that I now controlled. The HOA's next payment was due on Monday, and they didn't have the money to cover it. Tom Harris called me Saturday morning to discuss options, his voice heavy with the responsibility of cleaning up someone else's mess. "I know this whole situation got way out of hand," he said. "We're hoping you might be willing to work with us on some kind of payment plan that keeps the road open for community access." I'd been thinking about this conversation since Thursday night, weighing my legal rights against my moral obligations to neighbors who'd done nothing wrong. The nuclear option was available. I could restrict access to the road and force the HOA into immediate bankruptcy, but that would hurt innocent families who just wanted to fish and swim at the lake. People who had had no part in Cynthia's fraud scheme. We met that afternoon at the community center Theism room, where everything had exploded 2 days earlier. Tom brought the new treasurer and 2 other board members, all looking like people who had inherited a disaster they hadn't created. I brought my lawyer and a draft agreement I'd worked on over the weekend. The terms were fair but firm. The HOA would make regular payments on the access road debt, maintain the road to agreed standards, and follow clear rules for community use of the lake area. "Here's what I'm willing to offer," I said, spreading the draft contract across the table. "Monthly payments instead of quarterly, which should be easier to manage with your cash flow problems. Fair fees for lake access that cover insurance and basic maintenance, but nothing that would price out working families. And most importantly, zero tolerance for harassment, fake citations, or any future attempts to claim authority over my property." Tom Harris signed the agreement on behalf of the HOA, his relief visible as he realized that the road would stay opened. Families could continue accessing the lake. "I know we don't deserve this consideration after everything that happened," he said, shaking my hand. "But I want you to know that most of us never supported Cynthia's tactics. We just didn't understand the legal situation well enough to stand up to her when it mattered." Deputy Benson stopped by my ranch Monday evening to update me on the criminal charges against Cynthia. The district attorney's office is filing multiple counts, he said. Fraud, harassment, filing false police reports, and misuse of emergency services. She's looking at significant fines and possible jail time. He handed me a citation to give to Cynthia if I saw her, then added with satisfaction, follow actual laws, not made-up ones. The community gradually settled into a new normal. Over the following weeks, families continued using the lake under the new access agreement, paying modest fees that covered insurance and road maintenance. The HOA focused on legitimate community issues like landscaping and pool repairs, staying within their actual legal authority. Tom Harris proved to be a competent interim president, bringing transparency and fiscal responsibility to an organization that had been badly mismanaged. I found myself in the strange position of being a reluctant landlord, owning debt that gave me authority over community infrastructure I'd never wanted to control. The responsibility felt heavier than I'd expected, knowing that my decisions affected dozens of families who just wanted peaceful access to recreational activities. The irony wasn't lost on me that Cynthia's attempt to force me into her HOA had resulted in the exact opposite outcome. I wasn't in her HOA, but now she and every resident in Willowbrook Heights had to ask my permission to access the lake that had started this whole mess. The roles had completely reversed with the person who had tried to steal my property, now dependent on my goodwill for basic community services. Sitting on my porch that evening, watching cars drive past on the access road toward family fishing trips and sunset picnics, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The lake reflected the last light of day, undisturbed by legal threats or fake rules, just still water and clean air. For the first time, people waved because they wanted to, not because someone told them to. And somehow, that quiet moment said more than any courtroom ever could. Maybe the real lesson here is that boundaries mean nothing unless they're built on honesty, not control. If you're still here, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. And if this one hit home and you'd like to support the channel, the little thanks button is down there somewhere. Stay steady, stay smart. And if someone tries to draw a line through your land, make sure they're standing on the right side of it. Greater than that's a wrap, from HOA reported, but don't go far. There's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting for you on ours.